Hello and welcome back to On the Fly. Today I'm going to bring you part 5 of our 19-part series where we break down each country's international hockey season. Today's topic is going to be Team Czechia. Now the Czechs at this year's international season were a team that in some aspects succeeded, some aspects kind of disappointed in a way. And we'll break it all down here. We'll start, of course, with the first tournament of the year, the World Juniors. And when we look at this tournament for the Czechs coming in, they were a team that I think many, including myself, kind of saw as the 5th ranked team in the grand scheme of things, where you kind of looked at it, it was the teams like Canada, the US, and Sweden, kind of your top 3. You have the Finns kind of 4th, and then the Czechs were 5th, and at least that was kind of my expectations of what we were going to see in this tournament. And in some ways that did kind of come true a little bit, but in other ways we saw the Czechs really take it to the next level in this tournament and really carry the momentum from the year prior, where we got to see once again the Czechs knock off Canada in the quarterfinals. So at the very least, this Czech team has shown that they are willing to compete. And now we'll hop into kind of the game-by-game breakdown. Obviously, they start with the 5-1 win over the Swiss, followed up with a 14-2 victory over the Kazakhs, then a more tight checking game, a 4-2 win over the Slovaks, and of course they do follow it up with a 4-2 loss to the Swedes, ending their preliminary play, which sets them up for Canada. And obviously we already touched on it about, sort of the history coming in for them, but already having some success against the Canadians from last year's tournament, you bring that into this quarterfinal. You're playing the Canadians on home ice, and what's the key to beating a team on home ice? Take them out early. And sure enough, that's what the Czechs did. And fortunately for them, they held on to the lead. They let it go a little bit towards the end, but they found the goal that really put them over the top late in the game, and that was the separator. And that pushed them, of course, on to the semifinals, where a little bit of an unfortunate game against the U.S., where the U.S. was just a better team in this one. But, we look at it, that's the kind of game that they were looking to play. And unfortunately, they just got beat by a better team, a 4-1 loss in the semis. And then the bronze medal game where they beat the Swedes 3-2 in the shootout. And that was arguably one of the games that the Czechs wanted to play, and they wanted to win the bronze. And we've talked about it a lot on this channel. We've talked about it in our Sweden recap, which we did already. And it was one of those games for the Czechs that they just wanted it more. And you could tell that they wanted it more, which is why they ended up winning the bronze. And it was very much unlike their round robin game, obviously with the Swedes taking that one. But it was a different game, I thought, than what we saw in the prelims, where the Czechs clearly wanted to win the bronze for their country, for their fans. And unfortunately for the Swedes, just not quite the same enthusiasm about it. And that, in my eyes, was the real differentiating factor in this one, as the Czechs do secure the bronze medal at this year's World Juniors, obviously following some success from the years before. And it'll be interesting to see what this Czech team can do this year, whether or not it'll be another upset against a tough Canadian team. And obviously the Canadians, with the new management, new coaches intact, should be interesting to see what's to come. But in the same respect, this Czech team has shown at this tournament they are dangerous and a team to watch out for. So definitely stay tuned, because honestly, it's going to be a good tournament, and I'm excited to see what the Czechs can do. They're a team that obviously has kind of come up the last few years and has made a real push for gold. And honestly, I think it's only a matter of time for them before they realize that goal, but you really never know. So for the Czechs at this juniors, obviously an accomplishment to win the bronze, but when you look at their expectations, kind of ranking in as the 5th team, that's what you wanted to see, is them kind of just exceed those expectations. A good start to the international year for them, which leads us into the next tournament, the women's U18s, where the Czechs did secure another bronze medal. This was a tournament coming in that I think very similarly to the juniors, is they weren't really expecting to be that team and to be, in a medal contention. Obviously, that was kind of the goal, but I'm not sure that they were expecting to be where they were. And, they win a couple key games, the games that matter, as we always like to talk about, and they kind of find themselves in the contention. And sure enough, you win the one game that matters against the Swedes, in, once again, another bronze medal. That's the key for them in this one, and they did end up taking the bronze. So they start the tournament a 2-1 overtime victory over the Swiss. They then go on to beat Slovakia 6-3, and then they lose to Canada 5-0 in the prelims. Then on the playoffs they go, where they beat the Finns 6-0. This was a dominant effort from start to finish for them. And then unfortunately they lose just short of the Canadians, a 4-2 loss in this one, pushing them into the bronze medal game, where they once again beat the Swedes to secure the bronze medal. And I think this game, we looked at this one for the Czechs, for the Swedes, it was that kind of game that you were expecting, where both teams wanted the win. And once again, it was just kind of which team wanted it more. And in the end, it was the Czechs, and that's who walked out of there alive. So, for the Czechs, a really good start for them to start the year. Obviously, you look at these kind of tournaments where it's all about to see what's to come. And we'll talk about the Women's Worlds in a little bit, but these tournaments build on each other, right? Where if it's the men's U18s, the men's U18s lead into the men's U20s, the juniors, which lead into the men's worlds. The women's U18s lead onto the women's worlds. And you want to try and see that progress year over year. And we've seen that progress from this Czech side the last few years, as they really return to be a dominant force in the international world. And I think it's only, once again, a matter of time before you see them as kind of the top dog, obviously winning the men's worlds last year as well. Or I guess 2 years ago, if you want to say this past year was last year. But those are the kind of results you're looking for. They've put a real good showing on the Women's Worlds, which we'll talk about right after this. But the truth is that they're right around the corner, and I think it's only a matter of time before this Czech team kind of finds that next groove, and then they are the team to beat. So for as much as I think it is still a few years away, it is on the rise, and the Czechs are a team that very well could be replacing teams like the Finns and the Swedes and the Canadians and the US in a matter of years. Obviously a dangerous team. I'm not sure if they're quite there yet, but I think they are right around the corner. So that'll do it for our women's U18s. We'll now flip over to our Women's Worlds. And for the Women's Worlds, it was a tournament coming in, obviously hosted in České Budějovice, Czechia, that I would say for this Czech team, they had high expectations for. Not necessarily to, the medal might not have been, or the gold medal might not have been their exactly goal in expectation for this tournament, but to put on a good showing for their home fans, I think was more than anything their goal for this tournament. And I think they did that in ample throughout this entire tournament. And it was one of those tournaments that I think for the Czechs that they're going to look back on in a couple of years. And you'll probably see it in, 5-10 years time with the women's U18s, where you have the young kids in Czechia who are rising up, who are going to talk about this Women's Worlds team or this Women's Worlds tournament that kind of inspired them to play that next level. And sure enough, in a couple of years, you might see the resurgence. And obviously the Czechs have been good on the women's side, especially the last few years. We've seen their program really rise, but I think we could see them take it to that next level and start to contend with teams like Canada and the US, which we saw a little bit of this past tournament. But we'll go into the games for the Czechs, starting off the tournament with a 3-0 win over the Swiss. Wasn't my favorite game from the Czechs, but good enough. You get the 3 points. It's really all you can ask for. Follow it up with a 4-0 loss against the US. This was a game that really the penalties killed them. I think 3 of their 4 goals for the US were off of penalties or power plays. And so for this US team, you can't give them opportunities, because if you give them opportunities, they're going to bury it eventually. And unfortunately for this Czech team, just kind of found themselves on the wrong side of the whistle. And that really was one of the separating factors in this one with the Czechs and the US. But it is important to note that they did contend for most of it 5-on-5. And I think that was one of the things that they really drew upon in their eventual rematch, was that 5-on-5 play was very close. And it really is just going to come down to 1 or 2 bad bounces. And then to the third game we go, where they lost 4-2 to the Finns. Now, this game, I think, hurt them more than any of the other games. Obviously, the bronze medal hurt as well. But I think you lose to the Finns, the team that, frankly, you should be beating. But when we look at it, for this Czech team, they were hoping to put on a show for their home fans. In the grand scheme of it, does it really matter? Not really. Well, you get the third or fourth spot in Group A. But what I will say is I think that win kind of stung a little bit, and you follow that up, of course, with the game against the Canadians, losing 7-1, where once again you kind of contended until it just kind of got out of hand. And that tends to be the storyline especially whenever Canada plays, is it's a tight game, it's nice and close, and then it starts to get away. And if you can keep it in like they did in the semis, it's okay. But as soon as you let teams like Canada, like the US, go 1 goal, 2 goal, 3 goal, then you start to find yourself in a problem. So tight checking games for this Czech team was crucial. And unfortunately, this Canada game just kind of got out of hand late, which was one of the reasons why the score looked so ugly. And then we go to the quarterfinals, where the Swiss just got absolutely pummeled by this Czech team, an invigorated Czech team, if you will, a 7-0 win for them over Switzerland. And this was a game that, it was dominant, and that's the kind of game you were expecting to see out of this Czech team. Then to the next game we go, the semifinal game, where of course the US did beat the Czechs 2-1. And this was one of those games where, for this Czech team, it was an unfortunate end. And it was one of those games where both sides were so close right to the very end. It all comes down to 1 or 2 bounces. And sure enough, those 2 bounces went in the Czech net for the Czechs. Couldn't quite find that goal to bounce back from, as they do lose this one 2-1. And then, of course, the bronze medal game we go, where they did lose in overtime to the Finns. And this was one of those unfortunate games that I think just kind of gets out of hand. And as much as you might want to sort of take the positive, it was a great tournament, this not getting the medal on home ice does sting a little bit. And I think you'll look back on it and kind of wonder, well, what if, should have, could have, especially with that game in the semis, because all of a sudden you're not playing for a chance at the gold and a guaranteed shot at silver. And now you walk out of the tournament 1 goal away from a guaranteed medal, instead of going home with nothing. So for this Czech team, an unfortunate end, but I do think that there's lots to be proud of and a lot to take into this next year's Olympics. A lot of momentum was generated. Don't count out the fact that there is momentum generated at these tournaments. We'll talk about the men's worlds in a little bit as well for them, but the women's worlds is what you'll likely be seeing, the players you'll likely be seeing at this year's Olympics. So it is a pretty big deal to be able to contend so tightly with teams like the US and Canada through and through, because those are the kind of teams you're going to need to beat in order to win yourself the gold at the Olympics. Don't count out teams like the Czechs at that, because that's going to be an interesting one as well. The Czechs do walk out of the Women's Worlds with a 4th place finish, not securing a medal on home ice, a disappointing end, but still a tournament to be very proud of, which brings us on to the men's U18s. Now, this was a tournament for this Czech team where you knew walking into your group it was going to be a tough ride. You had to beat teams, of course, like the US, like Sweden in your own group. Teams like Canada were on the other side of the bracket, so you knew it was going to be a tough ride. And you start this tournament a 4-2 loss to the US. You followed up with a 4-3 loss in overtime to Germany. You beat the Swiss 4-2, which was kind of the redeeming factor, pushing them in, of course, guaranteeing them a spot in the playoffs. And then the eventual 7-3 loss to the Swedes, a tough loss there, I might add as well. And then that brings you to the quarterfinals, and you're playing the Canadians, who I would say probably had one of the 3 best teams there, with sort of your Swedens, your Canada, and your US was kind of the big 3 at this tournament as well, where those were the teams that you were trying to avoid if you could. Unfortunately for this Czech team, they got the poor straw with having to play Canada in the quarterfinals, and they played them really hard. And this game, quite frankly, could have went either way, and we already had the one Canada-Czechia incident in the World Junior quarterfinal. So obviously stuff like that does play in the back of players' heads, and fortunately for the Canadians this time, finding the lucky goal in overtime to put them into the semifinals. the Czechs' road will end with that loss, which secured them a 7th place finish at this year's men's U18s. An unfortunate end for them, but still a tournament that I think they could be very proud of, and just unfortunately found themselves on the losing end. So that'll be it for our U18s. We'll now flip over to the final tournament of the international hockey season, the Men's Worlds. And this year's Men's Worlds for the Czechs coming in was, in many ways, obviously as the defending champions of that tournament, they had hopes of winning gold once again, going back to back. And you looked at the way that their group was stacked up, and there was a decent enough opportunity to A, of course, make the quarterfinals, B, get a good matchup in the quarterfinals, and then make the semis and eventual have a shot for a gold medal. Unfortunately for them in this tournament, they lost one game that mattered, and that was the eventual loss that hurt them the most because it ended up knocking them out of contention and putting them in a real tough matchup against arguably one of the best teams at this tournament on paper. And that was in many ways the difference between the Czechs making it far in this tournament and not, was one key loss. We'll go into the games now. 5-4 overtime win for the Czechs against the Swiss. This game was an interesting game for the Czechs, and one that I think in many ways they would have liked to have got the full 3 points out of. Obviously a tough team in the Swiss, your eventual silver medalist for the second straight year. But I think that this kind of game against the Swiss was the start of the end for this Czech team. And this was the kind of game that they wanted to win decisively to show the rest of the group that they were the team to beat. And yes, they ended up winning, ended up getting the points, the win points, which is always good, but they would have liked to win this one in regulation, which I think, looking back on it in the end, could have very well been a decisive factor. Then you go to the second game against the Norwegians, which was a 2-1 victory for the Czechs. Tighter game, obviously would have liked to have won by a little bit bigger of a margin. But then you kind of look for what's the response. You go and you play the home Danes on home ice for the Danes, and that's the kind of game that you really need to bring your best for. And sure enough, they did. A 7-2 victory in that one. They follow that one up with a 6-1 victory over Hungary, an 8-1 win over Kazakhstan, 5-0 win over Germany, and then it comes down to the game that matters. You're trying to win the group, trying to guarantee yourself an easy spot, an easy seed, to basically have to avoid either playing Canada or Sweden. And unfortunately, they lose to the U.S., a 5-2 loss, which ends up seeding them against the Swedes. And flip over now to the playoffs, where they do lose 5-2 against the Swedes. And this was kind of the unfortunate part about the way the groups were set up this year, was one of the top 3 teams in Group B, obviously between the Swiss, the U.S., and the Czechs, were going to have to play either Canada or Sweden. And unfortunately for the Czechs in this one, they just drew the short straw and had to play the Swedes, which was a very tough game. And they just got beat by a better team on home ice. The Czechs walk away from the Men's Worlds with a 6th place finish. An unfortunate end, I think, when you look at it, just based off they're the defending champions, high expectations coming in, another solid squad, but unfortunately falling just short this year and placing 6th place overall in the tournament, which leads us over to our recap. And we look at this sort of international year for the Czechs. You know, you get 2 bronze medals at the World Juniors and the Women's U18s. You also have a 4th place finish at the Women's Worlds, a 5th place finish at the Men's Worlds, and then you have a 7th place finish at the U18s. And so what I'll say about it is, as much as it hurts, I think you look at kind of where it should have been. I think, you know, you exceed expectations at the juniors, at the U18s. You fall a little bit short at the Worlds. You fall a little bit short at the Men's Worlds. So I think a sort of a C+, you might even give it a B- grade for this Czech team makes the most sense. But it's a tough exit, right? And as much as, you know, it was a good year for the Czechs, they exceeded expectations at some of the tournaments. There were key tournaments that, frankly, they just fell a little short of, and that's why I think they're as low as they are. Men's Worlds and Women's Worlds in particular, where there's no medal at the Women's Worlds, which I think is arguably the biggest disappointment of them all. The Men's Worlds, I think you just kind of lost one game. Other than that, they did play well. But then it becomes what's next for them. And we move to 2026, where we will see them in a bunch of different tournaments, right? Where we'll see them at the juniors, the women's U18s, both Olympics, women's and men's. I'll see them at the women's worlds, the men's U18s, and the men's worlds as well, where the women's worlds, of course, still to be announced when and where, likely going to be coming sometime in October. But for for this upcoming year, look at the World Juniors, a team that has been in medal contention the last 2 years. I'm expecting them to continue that success, and it would not surprise me in the least to see them fighting for a gold medal at some point. Whether it be next year, I don't really know. You look at some of the teams that are red hot right now. You're going to look at the Canadians. You're going to look at the U.S. as always. You're going to look at the Swedes. The Finns are going to be good as well. So it's going to be a tough year for the Czechs to contend again. But as you've seen year after year, the Czechs are a tough out. So you never can count them out. The women's U18s, I think it's still a little bit early to try and figure out what that's going to look like. It'll be an interesting tournament, I think, for this Czech team. I think they're always contenders at that kind of tournament, especially the last few years, so never count them out on that one. Women's Olympics, I think you're going to see this Czech team really make a mark. I don't know if they'll be able to knock off a team like Canada or the US, but I think they'll definitely put another scare into them. It will be interesting. I am very excited for this Women's Olympics. I think it's going to be the most competitive we've seen it in years. Especially with the Czechs now as sort of a third wild card team where we could very well see a new silver gold medalist at this Olympics. So I am excited, to say the least, for this. It's going to be an interesting year. It's going to be a great tournament. And then the men's Olympics, which I think when you look at the women's Olympics, arguably the most competitive we've seen it in years. I think you could say the very much same with the men's side, where you're going to be looking at teams like Canada and the U.S., kind of as your big two powerhouses, but then you're going to have the Swedes and the Finns and the Czechs, and the Swiss could be an interesting one too, where we've seen them sort of take it to new heights on the international level. And then there's other teams in there as well, that teams like the Slovaks, who could be a very interesting team that might scrounge up a win or two and upset some teams at these kind of tournaments. So I think it's going to be an interesting year at the men's Olympics. I think for this Czech side, it's going to be a year that for the Olympics, it's time to show what you are on the biggest level. Obviously, they won the men's worlds last year at home, or 2 years ago, whatever you want to call it, at home. They're going to want an effort very similar to that at the Olympics, where you're looking for your best players to be your best players. It wouldn't surprise me to see them be in medal contention. It would not surprise me to see them fighting for the gold medal. But it also wouldn't surprise me to see them being early exits. And I think it's just going to come down to what team shows up from the Czechs that ends up deciding their fate. And I think it's going to be a really interesting tournament for the Czechs, for both the men's and the women's side at the Olympics. A lot of heads still to be turned. We might be heading towards an old school Czech Republic type game, or a type performance at these Olympics. So I'm very excited to watch along to see what this Czech team can do. Do not count them out. They are going to be around, and they are going to be turning some heads. Women's Worlds, very similar to the Olympics. Going to be an interesting tournament. I don't know how many players will play both the Olympics and the Women's Worlds. I don't know when the Women's Worlds is going to be. That's the other part, so that'll be an interesting one as well. The men's U18s, once again, still a little bit early. The U18 division is always tough to tell what's to come, especially how late it is. We're still, I think it's 8 months away from that, so it's a little bit early to say what the teams are going to be looking like. Then to the men's Worlds, where for this men's Worlds, they're going to be looking for another repeat performance. But once again, like the women's Worlds, I don't know how many players are going to be playing in both the Worlds and the Olympics, and you'll also have to deal with the NHL season to see which players are going to come over for the Czechs. But it should be an interesting tournament for them no matter what. This year for the Czechs, a decent year. Some outperforming expectations, some below. But now it's just a matter of what's to come in 2026. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. If you'd like to drop a like, if you really like, consider subscribing, tell all your friends, leave a comment down below your thoughts on Czechia. Until next time, see you.